I'm a 53-year-old experienced outdoorsman. Live in the mountains of Colorado, worked as a fishing guide, and have spent many nights camping in the backcountry. The area where I live is surrounded by national forest. Having lived in several cities, I've always been more comfortable in the woods than anywhere else. Spent weeks fishing, hiking, and camping in remote areas of Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and even Idaho. Encountered many black bears and a few grizzlies. Lions are elusive, so I've only ever seen one. Occasionally see fresh tracks and have the feeling of being watched for sure. Only been scared a few times in the woods, and only twice have I been terrified and have no good explanation for either event. So I decided to go on an afternoon hike one day. I like a particular trail where I park about 6 miles from home. Parked and saw one other truck, drank some water and made a sandwich before locking everything including phone and gun in truck. I was intentionally traveling light so I could move fast, only planned about 30 minutes in and 30 back, wearing running shoes, shorts, t-shirt and bright yellow baseball hat. Notable too that hat is so obnoxiously bright that friends say it probably scares the fish away. So I began running around 2 p.m. as the first few miles are relatively flat. The trail follows a creek that flows off of a mountain through a canyon. There are several trails that branch off heading up onto the mountains. I prefer a particular trail that follows the edge of the canyon with creek flowing below. It's absolutely gorgeous as well. Before the trail gets steep, it takes you through a sort of large aspen grove. There's a point about 30 minutes in where I plan to turn around. Trail becomes increasingly less worn and more difficult beyond this point. And while I have hiked this area many times, something just felt off at this time. I just didn't feel normal. I moved through the aspen grove before taking the steep trail up the mountain when I just got a strange feeling. I stopped and noticed that it was dead quiet. Something made me look up the mountain to the right to a point several hundred yards above, and I noticed a large granite rock formation. The area is off trail, so I'd never really looked there before. Thought I saw movement though, probably a black bear as they're pretty common here. Curious, I pressed on. Definitely not scared at this point, but I just noticed the silence. I continued hiking and reached the point where I planned to turn around. Decided to hike a bit further though, hoping to see what caught my eye earlier. The trail becomes overgrown and harder to follow at this point. I'd been further than this before, but never off this trail like this. I noticed an aspen tree bent over the trail. It had actually been uprooted and broken off. The tree was green, so that was pretty odd. It could have been lightning though, but it wasn't clear. I walked maybe another 1/8 of a mile, then took a right off of the trail heading in the direction of the granite rocks. I wasn't too concerned about getting lost, since it was easy to orient myself with canyon and creek. I hiked off the trail up toward a large meadow with many granite boulders. Reflecting on it too, something was definitely compelling me to go to that meadow. Climbing and scrambling uphill, I eventually get to somewhere where I could sit. I got to the meadow as well and noticed the rocks. They looked like sort of a granite fortress. I sat down on a log enjoying the scenery, looking down into the canyon and the creek below. Meadow and rocks were behind me. I looked around and didn't see any animals, but suddenly noticed that it was dead quiet again. It had been a sunny and warm day with birds and bugs everywhere. I wasn't scared yet, but noticed the extreme silence for sure. I could hear the creek before, so it wasn't as startling as now, but I began taking off my running shoes. This isn't something that I normally do, since I have permanent nerve damage to my right ankle. I walk and run with a bit of a limp, and sometimes even wear a brace. I remember it feeling, though, like my feet were burning. It wasn't particularly hot, and not over 70 degrees, but I was becoming unnerved by the dead silence, and I started tying my shoes on. And this is where things got really weird. I clearly, and I mean clear as day, heard my father call me by my first name. The voice was loud and came from behind me. I'd actually talked to my father earlier in the day, and he was at home in Georgia, and there was no way that he was calling me from the rocks behind me. I immediately became overwhelmed with fear, though. It's difficult to describe how overwhelming it was, but I began sweating and shaking. It was kind of like knowing a lion is stalking about, without seeing it, but even more terrifying. Definitely not messing around at this point, though. So I stood up and turned to look behind me, and I saw nothing but the large granite rocks. I didn't wait around, though, and I started hauling it down the hill towards the canyon and the trail below. Absolutely terrified and feeling something was chasing me the whole time. I literally stumbled and fell and rolled down the mountain a couple of times as well. I stood up and couldn't recognize anything. Everything just looked completely different all of a sudden. No canyon, creek, or trail. It was cloudy, and I wasn't in the same place anymore. At this point, I started hauling it again in what I thought was the right direction. Eventually, I found the trail and recognized my location. I sprinted through the aspen grove back to the truck, didn't look at my watch, not sure how long I was gone for. I was so terrified that I could hardly drive home. I really wasn't sure what happened, but I've never, ever been so afraid before. And I know for a fact that something was stalking and chasing me down that mountain. Yes, I have gone back to the area to scope it out. Too afraid to go to the same meadow with the granite boulders, but I considered going back well armed, but instincts tell me that it's just a bad place and to stay away. But I'll tell you one thing. I'll never hike again without my Magnum, and I haven't since. Something scared the heck out of me up there, and I feel I was close to being a victim to something. I trust that my flight instinct kicked in for a good reason, and I'm never going back there, ever again. In my formative years, I was frequently sent to stay at my grandparents' house, as both of my parents worked odd hours and struggled to take care of me during the shifts. At such a young age, this was simply a time for me to eat as much candy as I wanted and stay up until midnight watching Cartoon Network. The only thing that made my stay with my grandparents better was when my cousin Carly was also staying with them. My grandparents lived in a house that bordered a major highway, and as such had a large brick sound barrier between the main road and the alley that ran behind the houses. This sound wall was getting old though, and there were some places in it that needed major repair. One such place was at the far end of the alley, near the local park. Behind a nice set of shrubs, the wall had been slowly crumbling and was the perfect size for two 8-year-olds to squeeze through. Now, the location of this wall, the shrubs, and their relation to my grandparents' house is pretty important for this story. The shrub itself covered the crack in the wall perfectly from the road. You couldn't actually see the crack until you stepped behind the shrub and bent down, due to how low it was to the ground. The wall itself was at the far end of the alley, of which my grandparents' house was second or third at the start of the alley. According to Google Maps, the alley is about 1,000 feet long from the house to the crack. Once you reach the cracked wall, the alley turns left and continues for another 500 feet until it dumps out into the main street. So Carly and I like to walk along the alley with a bag of cookies, slip under the crack and walk to the other side of the road to play at the playground. This being the 90s, we had no adult supervision beyond us vaguely shouting to our grandparents that we were headed to the park. On this occasion, however, Grandma was at the store and Grandpa was going to some church event or something. They obviously hadn't told us that we could leave the house, but they also hadn't told us that we had to stay inside either, if you catch my drift. So, the past few days that Carly and I had gone to the park, there were always people there due to it being a weekend. As it was full of people those days, I don't remember this detail, but Carly told me a few years ago that she remembers seeing the same grey van parked alone at the park the 2 days in a row that we went there. On this Monday, however, the park was deserted. Carly and I were having a blast though, swinging and sliding with no kids to get in our way. We were so preoccupied, in fact, that neither of us remember seeing a charcoal grey Dodge Grand Caravan pull up and park in the parking lot. After a little while, Carly pulls me down the playground into one of the plastic tunnels and tells me to be quiet. "Chris, I think that guy in the van is watching us," she told me. "He's been there on his phone for a while now." I not so subtly peek my head out of the tube and see the man staring right back at me, as if he knew exactly where we were hiding. He indeed had some kind of phone to his head as well, and was talking at a rapid pace from what I could tell. Carly and I decided that we would get out, swing some more, as to not seem suspicious, obviously, and then we would head home at a brisk walk. I reasoned with Carly that he wouldn't follow if he didn't think that we were running from him. A solid logic, I know. Looking back, I realize now just how dangerous of a situation that we could have been in. The situation started to get much worse, though, when the man hung up on his phone and got out of the van. He stepped out of sight to the driver's side sliding door, and we saw him open it up. And it was at this stage that I got my first very bad feeling of the afternoon, and basically whisper shouted to Carly, "We need to go, now." We both pop off the swings and as close to a dead sprint as we can, and left our basketball and cookies right where they were. As we reach the park fence, we hear the sliding door slam and the driver door close shortly after that. We look back to see the van sliding out of its parking space. We bolted across the road. Carly started to shimmy into the crack behind the shrub, but I was watching the van. Instead of coming down the road, we ran across. The van drove straight and disappeared from view. And this is when my second very bad feeling kicked in. I grabbed Carly's shirt and pulled her back, telling her that we needed to go another way. We both started walking down the main highway, cars whizzing by, on the other side of the sound wall. As we reach the end of the wall and start to turn into the subdivision, we catch ourselves when that grey Dodge pulled out of the alley and turned down the street in front of my grandparents' house. We give the van a good 5 count and then sprint down the alley to make it inside the backyard. At this point, we bolt inside, lock every single lock that we can find, and both grab kitchen knives and head to the living room. I really don't know what we thought that we would do with those said knives, but we placed them on the ground and turned on some cartoons. A little while later, creepy man forgotten, I went to the kitchen to grab a Mountain Dew. Now, my grandmother had this beautiful full-wall glass window sitting area, put in a few years prior, and it had no shades or curtains on it. I thought nothing of this until I noticed a charcoal grey Dodge Grand Caravan slowly making its way down the street. I jumped back and I ran to the living room to tell Carly what I had seen immediately. We both proceeded back to the kitchen, like the dumb kids that we were, and peered over the ledge of the sitting area. The Dodge was stopped right in front of the house, and the man was staring right back at us. At that exact moment, we hear both the garage door opening to admit our grandmother, and watch my grandfather come around the corner of the street. And as soon as my grandpa parked his car in front of our house, the creepy guy nonchalantly pulled away and just drove off. Our grandpa was more than a little annoyed that we had locked not only the knob and the deadbolt, but also the floor lock, chain, and the door jamb lock on the front door. But for context too, the area that they lived could be comparable to South Dallas or some of the nicer areas of Chicago, I suppose. Once our grandma let him in though, we were threatened with a whooping for touching the locks, until my grandma persuaded him that it was just kids being kids. We both then told them our story, but neither of them believed us. Apparently my grandpa was reading an address or something as he drove up and he never saw the van. And my grandma was always convinced that their street was the safest street in the history of all streets. But upon talking later as adults and revisiting the alley in the park, Carly and I came to the same conclusion. Regardless of whatever creepy McCreeper wanted with us, he had been stalking us for at least a few days at that point. As I said before, the crack was not visible in any shape or form, and you couldn't have seen it if you were taller than 5 feet due to the cramped space, which meant that Mr. Creeper had apparently watched us duck down at least once, and likely watched the alley end as well, so as to know where we came out. Carly swears that she saw Mr. Creepy at the park later that summer, in the same charcoal grey Dodge, but I never encountered him again, so I can't confirm that. Sometimes Mr. Creepy pops up in my memories, though, even 15 years later, and I think about all this. And to this day, I do often wonder what would have happened to us if I had followed Carly through that crack in the wall all that time ago. This started in September of 2018. I had just started college and didn't have any friends there. The only person that I spoke to was my ex-boyfriend. But he introduced me to this woman, Kat, who was 27. I was 16, but despite the age difference, we got on pretty well. Then my ex dropped out of college and I started to talk to Kat more and we became pretty good friends. I would stay at hers and we'd get high and watch TV. Pretty fun, right? Then, though, it got weird. She wanted me to stay at hers 2 or more times a week, often ringing every other day and even phoning me 13 times in the space of a few weeks, asking me to go over. She then moved out of my city and moved to Manchester to go to uni. She asked me to stay at hers just after my 17th birthday for 2 weeks. This was the longest I'd ever been without my family, but I went anyway. Most of it was good, except for the times when I'd get kicked out so she could work. She was actually a sex worker, and when she'd leave me alone for over 12 hours to go to the pariah. She also gave me a necklace that said something about me being a daughter and being adopted. About 2 weeks after I got back to my city, she called me again, and she told me that she'd had a psychotic breakdown, that she could barely remember anything that happened over the past 3 days, had to be retained in hospital, and that she had tried to kill her best friend. She also made a point to say that she was okay until I left, basically trying to blame me for her breakdown. Now, any rational person would have cut this off then and there, but I guess I'm just too nice. I didn't tell my friends or my boyfriend what she'd done. I just kept it to myself and carried on as normal, until she said something to my boyfriend that just changed everything. So, my boyfriend and I are talking about moving out of my city when we go to university, and he told Kat and his friend this at college. She then says that you're stealing me, and this was the final straw. I told my boyfriend what she had done, and he was obviously wanting me to stop associating with her. She then sends me a message asking to meet after college, making a point to say, just the 2 of us. This was obviously terrifying, and I blocked her on social media and her phone number as well. She then gets another 17-year-old on my boyfriend's college course to ask why we've been bullying her, etc. It was incredibly pathetic, and I was left wondering who else that she would include like this. But after this, she left me a long string of messages saying that I was not to tell anyone anything that she told me, as I should respect her privacy, and I left her on the read. Anyway, long story short, I think I actually dodged a pretty big bullet there. So, this is going to be both experiences that have happened to me in the past, and also something that happened tonight that really scared me. I wanted to share this for a while, but this one seemed like a homeless person at first, I suppose. I have a few other encounters I'm tempted to put on here from when I was very young, but I'm worried that I was just your average overactive kid. But for a few months now, something weird has been hanging around and outside of my house. The first time it became apparent was when one night I was in the basement. Outside the window is a porch and there's a light switch for the lights by the door. I went upstairs for a bit when I realized later that I left the lights on, so I went downstairs to turn them off. Now, my father has tried endlessly to hook them to a timer with no success to his disappointment, and I assumed that he had finally figured it out and paid the lights no mind when I found out that they were off. What I didn't know though at the time was that my dad had given up weeks ago and put in an average light switch. The next morning I go down and I see the lights are on again. I assume the timer didn't turn them off, so I go to shut them off and then discover to my shock that it's a switch. This causes me to panic a bit because that meant that someone had been out there and the rest of my family was asleep last night, and quite likely they could have been watching me. A few weeks later, I'm sitting downstairs on the couch and I'm home alone. It's the dead of night, and my doggo is usually very relaxed with frequent events, but has a habit of being too chill sometimes. Suddenly, she perks up and looks to the window. Out of habit, I look with her and see something haunched and white dropping down over our fence and run past the windows. Thanks to the dirty windows and the glare of the lights, I couldn't even hope to make out what I saw or how big it was, but I yelped, panicked, and called my buddies. They were obviously skeptical, and I understand that, and told me that it was probably a raccoon, and I ended up agreeing. I went outside with my dogs, my older chocolate lab and my German puggle. It's a German Shepherd Pug Beagle mix, the one who had been with me. I went out trying to see what it was. Right away my dogs had two very different reactions. The lab was pacing and sniffing and looking around, and the other was wagging her tail and looking at the trees the way she does when I have treats. When suddenly, from said trees, I hear a loud groan. These are big, strong old trees as well, and trees don't groan the last time I checked. Not unless something is on them or there's huge winds or something. The mountain lion I saw that went up them a year ago proved that. The Midwest United States, by the way. So I tried shining my light up there, but I didn't see anything. But the trees are thick, and it wasn't until that mountain lion growled last time that I saw him up there in the broad daylight. For your interest too, it was weird seeing a mountain lion there when authorities came through and they ended up determining that it was sick and malnourished, so they weren't shocked that it wandered into the area, looking for food. But I ended up going inside because my puggle was moving between the trees with the same look. My Labrador seemed to be getting increasingly anxious, but now was staying away from the trees and just watching them. And I wasn't really seeing anything either, so in the end I just decided it was best to go inside. But all night I just heard these weird things. The worst one was a loud slam, like a tree branch had fallen, but there was nothing there, and my puggle kept going to the windows and acting unhappy about being kept in. But the rest was like the sound of something on the roof, pebbles being thrown at the window, and the return of a wannabe woodpecker or something, who would have likely been killed after my cats got a hold of the poor thing. By the way, I really don't know where my cats were in all of this. Now, this is where the climax that drove me here, though, happens. So it's been a couple of months now, and I've mostly forgotten about it. Occasionally I'll hear something weird on the front porch or footsteps, or the porch lights will get turned on mysteriously. But they're all small things that could be explained away, I suppose. Tonight, though, I was with my sister and FaceTiming with a friend in the basement again, when we hear this screeching sound. Now, my first concern was that two of the three cat siblings who had taken to taking over the area, which meant that they were likely fighting the raccoons. Dumb cats, I know. But the sound just didn't sound like any raccoon that I'd ever heard, but they make odd sounds, especially when things are attacking them. So I quickly run to the window in the next room where I think that I'll be able to see them. Then I go out to break the fight up from a safe distance. When I get to the window, I see out there, standing taller than me for sure, I'm like 6 foot, so pretty tall, was a gaunt white humanoid figure with its back turned to the window. I ducked out of sight quickly when I first saw this thing, and when I went to look back out the window, it was just nowhere to be seen. I at first thought that it must have been just my mind playing tricks on me. There was snow on the ground, and I was dying for a rational explanation because it scared me pretty badly. I was shaking, in fact. I told my sister, and she just laughed at me, and I went upstairs later that night and got everything ready for the night and locked up. And when I went back up front, I froze because I could see my cat, who seemed agitated, but calm for the most part, on the garage roof, looking at something on my porch. And that something was that same white figure, back turned again, except this time it was squatted down and sort of looking at my cat. It didn't seem agitated or anything. In fact, it kind of looked relaxed maybe, but then it turned its whole body, twisted, and it seemed to kind of straighten as it did it. The best example I can give is sort of like a meerkat, but it was so sudden, and I heard like a cracking noise, almost like bones cracking through the window. I never did see the face, and as soon as it turned, fight or flight kicked in, and I ran into my room as fast as I could. The last thing that I saw of it as I slammed the door was it on the railing as it leapt towards what I assume was the nearby tree. And ever since then, I haven't seen it again. But funnily enough, too, I actually really like paranormal stuff. Well, used to anyway, but it's another thing to experience it for sure. Anyway, I have more questions than answers, and I really don't know what else to say. I don't know what it is, but what I do know is that I desperately need some sleep, so I'm going to go and try and get some now. Thanks for listening. When I was much younger and far less concerned with consequences, I was introduced to a guy through a mutual friend that was well connected. It took me forever to figure out how this guy could stock a veritable roving pharmacy in his vehicle, but at the time I wasn't so much concerned with the how, just the when. Like, hey man, when can I purchase an irresponsible amount of diverted prescription medications from you? As I got to know him more, though, I learned more about my purveyor of happy pills, and he thoroughly threw off a really bad vibe. In fact, I would do my absolute best to avoid the post-deal hangout, but the guy was clearly and completely socially inept. Eventually, Dealer, I'll henceforth refer to him as D, starts attempting to insinuate himself into my group or friends more and more. He would call me constantly, text me like an abandoned Tinder date, and generally just harass me to hang out. We would be casually drinking beer in the backyard of my house, and he'd happen to be in the neighborhood, just like he'd accidentally take a load off and decide to stick around. Now, I'm not a complete jerk, so it was difficult to sell someone a clue who doesn't have a proverbial nickel to his name. I specifically remember a night when each of us were recounting macho stories of tussles and scrapes that we'd been in, and D decided that it was his turn to contribute, and it went something like, "Oh, that's nothing, man. One time I shot a man in the face with a short-off shotgun and beat the rap on self-defense technicalities." We all sort of went slack-jawed at this moment and nodded our heads, mumbling uncomfortably, "Wow, pretty cool." At that point, though, I think we all just assumed that he was a one-upper and would say whatever to reinforce the tough guy persona that he was so desperate to have us believe. I should have realized then, though, that maybe D wasn't exactly an asset to the societal fabric. But, you know, I didn't want to hurt the guy's feelings, plus drugs, right? A few weeks later into the summer, though, some of the boys and I decided to tie one on and head downtown to the clubs. Now, I know for a fact that I hadn't committed the felonious sin of imparting knowledge of our physical location to D, but somehow he materialized by my side as I was ordering a drink. Even in my own greatly impaired state, I could tell D was in a knee-walking, gutter-sucking blackout. It took me all of 30 seconds of surveying his slack expression, coupled with his glassy black eyes, doing the 1,000-yard stare, to surmise that D was not going to be a fun man to be around this night. My hypothesis soon proved all too accurate too, when he began pushing random people on the dance floor, accosting women in front of their respective boyfriends and husbands, all the while fiddling around in his pockets for something. And perhaps you're starting to see why D wasn't a pillar of social proficiency. Eventually, though, he was ejected from the club, and as a mission of pure mercy, I went outside to make sure that he at least found a cab home. That's when I discovered what D was looking for in his pockets all night. As I walked outside, I could see several bouncers surrounding this guy, and he was brandishing a 6-inch serrated fold-out knife at them. I still have no idea what possessed me to step in and corral him, and I still believe the only reason I wasn't cut to absolute ribbons is because of the Gumpy-like flexibility I'm afforded under the influence of alcohol and prescription medications. But I was finally able to convince him into a taxi, and I sent him packing. And it was at that point that I made a firm decision to stop doing drugs, and by proxy, stop seeing D. Ever. I blocked his number even, and refused to go out. It's lucky that I did too, because some months later, he found himself once again in a scuffle at that very same establishment. Only this time, I wasn't there to rescue him. And he stabbed a man 7 or 8 times, and hot-footed it into an alley in some sort of pitiful attempt at an escape. The police didn't have to do much sleuthing, as there were plenty of bystanders willing to point out his location. And D is now in a level 4 prison, and isn't eligible for parole for another decade or so. And I say, good. I want to preface this by saying that I didn't see any of this, mostly due to my vantage point, but I was in the room with her, so I was there. But roughly an hour ago, my wife and I were talking on her couch. Her seat allows for a peripheral view of one of our sets of half stairs, a tri-story house, and as I was saying something, she immediately jumps up and within a few seconds says that she saw a kid, not one of our two, walking down the stairs, and that is what spurred her sudden movement. Where I was sitting is essentially back to the stairs, but I lined up the shot, and even if I had been facing that way, the wall would have blocked it. But according to her, this is what she saw. So at the moment of realization of the figure, she felt a blanket was placed on her, attempting to tell her, "No, this is just your son, don't worry." But her internal instinct piped up and told her to not let this thing get behind her. Ironically, if that was its goal, I would have certainly seen it, if I'm in fact capable of such things. I don't know, this whole thing is weird. But it was lanky, possibly 2D, almost spindly like a spider, with knee joints resembling that of a spider. It had clothing on, unsure of exactly what, but it was wearing something. She saw it move, hand on the banister. The leg movement was similar to how your youngest kiddo would come down the stairs, just a bit more overreaching, like it had to force itself to do so. Its face was almost pure white and had absolutely no facial features. She tried to rationalize it immediately and failed to do so. Since I didn't see it, I'm forced to look at the conditions and do my best to reconcile it in my head, mostly so I can try and get some sleep tonight. The lighting was terrible on the stairs. There are 8 stairs, and at the top we have a nightlight, sort of wall outlet thing. She said it was on the 3rd from the top, stepping down the 4th from the top. The downstairs light illuminates it fairly well, and I can't chalk it up to dark corridor hallucinations or anything like that. Does anyone have any explanation as to what this thing might be? I'm at a total loss, and I have no idea what to think. It should be noted too that my wife appears to be very prone to the paranormal. I don't know what it is about her, but she has encounters and experiences from time to time. I myself have not experienced anything that I could not at the very least chalk up to weird timing or my brain playing some sort of a small trick on me. I certainly believe my wife though, but I don't share the experiences that she has had.